Scanning, Part 2. In this nugget, we address scanning, and this is Part 2, where we'll take a look at a few additional tools that we can use. And we'll also take a look really at Nmap. That's really the majority of what we'll be doing here. There's so many different ways of using Nmap. You can use an ehack scan, a TCP scan, a full connect scan, for example, UDP scans, and you can even do things such as fragmenting the scans to make them more evasive to IDS systems. So we'll take a look at a lot of Nmap stuff. One of the things we'll do specifically, and it has a little bit of a higher profile with Nmap, is also a side channel. I put that in its own bullet here because there's a lot of detail involved in performing a side channel attack, also known as an idle scan. And this is a kind of a scan that you'll do that helps to prevent someone from being able to track back the scan to your IP address because it's all bounced off of some other host. Alright, now when it comes to scanning, we looked at some things last nugget about some basic principles of scanning and things such as the three-way handshake and things like this that will help us to understand how scans actually work. Here we're going to take a look at some of the actual scans themselves. And before we do that, I want to point out several additional tools that could be used for scanning, and we may use some of these in the future here as well. But I'm pointing these out because the main tool we're going to be using is Nmap. And these are just some other tools that you could also use. And I'm going to use some things here as well that will not show up in this list. There's just so many ways of hacking things. One of those things is to use Netcat. This is a pretty good tool that's used for scanning systems. You can also use it to actually exploit systems. It's a very powerful tool, which we'll use a little bit later on. There's hping. A lot of times you'll see hping version 2 referred to in CEH materials, but the current version is actually 3, and that's the one I would use. There's also Nikto, which is we use to identify different things about web servers like banner grabbing and identifying some potentially exploitable information on those servers. We looked at that in a previous nugget where I demonstrated that. There's also BittyBlah. This is something that's identified in the exam objectives, but I don't really cover it a whole lot here for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a very large, complicated tool, and it's kind of a study on its own, but I would be aware of the fact that it can be used to kind of do a soup to nuts scan of a system and identify exploits. It can also be used even in conjunction with Metasploit, which we'll use on its own in the future here, to exploit a system. It's kind of a one-size-fits-all tool, but I don't really cover it in too much depth here because, among other things, it's really being replaced by a replacement tool called Yeti, which has not yet really fully been explored by a lot of hackers. So anyway, we're kind of halfway in between these two different versions. And then there's also Rapid7 Expose. These are actually from the same folks that do a lot of work with Metasploit, and I want to just show you a demonstration of that real quick. I've already run it in the past because it takes quite a while to run it against a target network, but this is what it would look like. And this is what it might look like when you actually run the scan. Now, you'll have to set this up in advance. You have to identify what your assets are, which means what your networks are, what the hosts are that you're trying to run the scan against. And this is generally used for internal scans. You wouldn't run this from outside the firewall as an internet stranger against a corporation or something like that. It's way too noisy, way too obvious. This is, again, mostly used for internal purposes. The Community Edition, which is free, it limits you to a certain number of hosts. I can't remember exactly how many it is, but it's for smaller networks. And if you wanted to run against a larger network, you'd have to pay for it. But this edition is free. And then what we do is we just run it. It takes several minutes, 9 minutes to run against all of these hosts here. This is just kind of my internal hacker network. This does not have any of my production machines in it. And we can see that it does a pretty good job of identifying. I mean, this one was a Vista client, but I thought it was a Vista Service Pack 2 or Server 2008 machine. And this is kind of a weird thing here because I had just refreshed the screen. Previously, it identified it as a completely different operating system. But anyway, it's pretty close there. And we can see here that it identified several vulnerabilities, for example, on this 2003 machine. Now, the drawbacks that we do have here, again, is that it's going to have you some false positives, although I think on this one it might actually be accurate for a lot of these because this is an out-of-the-box Windows Server 2008 server, and it's never been patched at all. And that's because I just want to start with the kind of a ground zero operating system here. But you can see several different vulnerabilities here. Again, some of these might be false positives. For example, this might be one. The DNS server allows cache snooping. What's that about? Well, that's actually turned on kind of by default. Because if the DNS server there resolves a name for one host, then when another host wants the same resolution in the future, Provided the TTL has not expired, it'll just serve that out of its local cache instead of going out to the internet to resolve that against other DNS servers in the future. So that's kind of by design. That may or may not be a weakness that we could have there. But let's just pick something out by, by random here. MS010112, Microsoft's thing here, critical, and so forth. And this gives you some identifiers on what kinds of things could take place and more specifics about that vulnerability. So that's just the kind of thing we were talking about earlier when I talked about vulnerability scanners. Could be very, very good, at least give you a starting point, but they're generally used for internal purposes and not generally used by penetration testers. And then as another example of a scanner, here's one that you can use sometimes. It's called NetDiscover. If you don't have it, you can just do a apt-get install NetDiscover, and it should be able to download it for you. And this just identified all the hosts on my network, including my Certified Ethical Hacker network, as well as my other production network. And it just identifies a lot of different things. Like this is my router, and it's from Cameo Communication. It's probably just the chipset in there. I don't really know what the operating system is, but just identifies the Mac vendor, so it doesn't give you a lot of information in that respect. For example, the VMware items, there's 3 or 4 VMwares there. Well, I have no idea what the operating system is behind that. I would have to use other tools to explore beyond that. This is just a Canon printer that I've got. This is actually a really good idea to use a printer, by the way, for side channel attacks, which I'll talk to you about here in a little while. They're just kind of forgotten about devices that you can use to exploit other devices. There's an Intel one, and I got a couple of TiVos here on the home network here as well. Although strangely, this one's not a TiVo device. It's an operating system, and I have no idea why it shows up as a TiVo. But there you go. So that's just another tool that could be used, but more than likely, Nmap is going to be the tool of choice. So what is Nmap? Nmap is a network mapper, and this is the primary scanning tool that hackers will use, although there are, again, other good ones out there. There's various UIs available and various operating systems for which this is compatible. If you want to use the UI version for Windows, then you would use ZenMap, and you can get that from nmap.org. There's a download page there for all of these different ones. And a lot of hackers are kind of starting to like this one, especially people that like a UI, but most of your hardcore hackers are still sticking with the Linux version. There's also the Mac OS X version that you can use. A lot of people are switching over to Mac OS X now, so that might be a good idea. There's one that's actually even available in a browser. That's kind of a handy item. One of those, as you can see from here, is the InProtect product, and this is just a web interface for Nessus and Nmap security scanners. That's kind of handy. And then this is also another one that's kind of cool. This is just one for a local scan, so if you wanted to scan your own computer, then you could use this. It's kind of a just for local purposes of your own machine, though. And that would be this item right down here, this Nmap Online. What this does is it scans for live hosts. That's normally the first thing you'll do when you scan this, because you want to find out what's there first. And then you want to identify sometimes the operating system that it's running. And then you want to identify any open ports, and then you'll start to launch your attacks against those ports. All right, let's take a look at Nmap and what kind of things it can do for us. The first thing, of course, we want to do is to do host discovery, as I mentioned a moment ago. So we'll do a ping sweep, which is very common, and you can do that with an Nmap dash and then S uppercase P, and then whatever network it is that you're trying to scan, or a specific individual host. But for this kind of thing, normally it's going to be a range of IP addresses. So I'll just press enter here. We could have also put on the end of that a greater than sign and the name of a file that we want this all to be spit out into, and then that way we could open it up in a text editor later on for further analysis. But for right now, it's going to dump the results out here on the screen. I could have also done this. Let me go here. I could have also gone, if you look at the bottom, to a -VV. That would have been very verbose, and that would show us both up hosts and down hosts. And this is what I was telling you about a moment ago, where we could say, scan result. That would be the name of a text file that we could spit all this out into. And anyway, we can see here that we have a number of hosts up, and I've just got several machines up here. It's part of my hacking network, so to speak. Not all these are production machines. Some of them are just there for purposes of discovering them, more or less. Notice that this does not tell us anything about the operating system that they're running, unless you can see it in the host name. That's kind of a giveaway there, though. Or it doesn't tell us what ports are open or any other vulnerabilities that might be there. We just know that they're up. Now that we know that that's true, what we could do is you could script this or something like that. You could take all of these specific IP addresses and you could put those into a given file, and then other scans that you do in the future could be using only these IP addresses. However, you also don't want to depend only on this. For example, if I take a look at the IP addresses here, I notice it goes from 47, what's the next one, to 90. So there's kind of a big gap in there. I wonder if there's any hosts in the middle there. Well, I happen to know, since it's my own network, that there is a host that's not showing up in this scan, even though it is a live host. So what's the problem there, and how can we resolve this? Well, here I am at the Windows Vista machine itself, and if I take a look at the network properties, let me just go down here to network and sharing, and then go to the firewall settings, you're going to see here that indeed we do have, there it is, Windows Firewall, we do have the firewall turned on. If I could go to change settings here, we'll see that there's just kind of a conventional setting, they're turned on, and the exceptions, you can make exceptions for specific kinds of ports if necessary. For example, if I've got file and printer sharing turned on, I also need the ports open for that. For example, 135, 139. If I've got remote assistance or remote desktop turned on, I need 3389. Some of these are automatically turned on for you anytime you enable one of those services. But anyway, the firewall is turned on, as we can see here, and as a result, it did not show up in our scans. Now, I'm also going to go ahead and run a tool here called Wireshark. So let me go ahead and open this up. Alright, now the next thing I've done is I've gone over to this Windows machine and I've run something here called Wireshark. This is just a packet capturing utility, very handy utility for deep analysis of what's going on with your network. A lot of different purposes for it, but my purpose right now is to show you what happens when Nmap actually is able to discover this host. So I put a filter in here as well because I want to look for only traffic that's coming from IP address 10.10.10.70, which is my Ubuntu Linux machine. Okay, so I'm going to go over here now, and I'm going to do an nmap-pn. What does that mean? This means that it will bypass the discovery mode and just assume that the host is available, and then it'll start testing various ports against this IP address to see if there's anything live on ports over there. And we can see that we have several ports that are available here, and I won't elaborate on those too much right now, but you remember from an earlier, let me go up here a little bit, from an earlier nugget that we talked about, various common port numbers, and you can see several of those identified right here. So anyway, then what we have here is, we got those ports open. Now let's go back over to our Vista machine, and I'm going to stop the capture, all right? And then let's take a look at what happens when it finds a port that's open. And this is where it becomes very important to understand about the three-way handshake that we've discussed earlier. So here we can see I've got a lot of VNC traffic going on. That's because my Ubuntu machine is being run through a VNC terminal. So there's a little bit of a superfluous traffic going on with that. But my filter here, I think I can make it a little bit clearer. Let's go to 49. I'm going to apply that. So what happens now is when it sends something across the port here, and this is going to be on the destination, or rather port 445, which we already identified was open on this host over here, we send it a SYN in this scan as part of a three-way handshake, and then here the host that has the port that's open, in other words .49, sends back, you can see over here to the right, a SYN ACK. And that's how the scanning Nmap knows that that port is open because it responded on that specific port number. Same with any of the rest of these. Let's just go to this one here, for example. This is our NetBIOS port of 139, and it sent back a SYN ACK on that as well. So when it received a SYN ACK in response to any of these things, that's when it knew that that port was open, and that's how we were able to arrive at this list. By the way, I'm going to show you several different Nmap options here, and I'm going to go back to our study guide here and just point out that if it looks a little baffling because of all the various options and things like that, well, there are quite a few things you can do there, and you do need to know about them for the exam purposes. So these are the most common ones that you should know about, so I would be familiar with these various switches that you can use, and I've got a description of what each one of those does over here, and then some more detail about some of those down here, the common Nmap scans, such as the ping sweep, which we've already done, and then the TCP connected would be another one that we could do. But I just wanted to show you that there is a document here that will help you to arrive at many of these successful scans. Now, this is a very flexible tool, by the way, Nmap. For example, I don't even have to use kind of a common TCP connection here. What I could do instead would be to use, actually I have to use sudo for this, sudo nmap, and then a -s capital P, and what that will do is going to send an ICMP timestamp request. Okay, I don't know why it's a P because that has nothing to, doesn't look like it has to do with time, but that's what it is. And then a hyphen cap PP. I made myself say PP. Anyway, I'll put in the IP address here, and we can again see that even with the firewall up, after I enter in the password, we'll see that now it shows to us that that host is up regardless of the fact that there is a firewall. And the reason for that, by the way, is because even if the firewall is configured to block ICMP requests, it's really just a standard kind of ICMP request, which would be an echo request that's used in ping commands. This one is a timestamp request, and it's not really configured to deny that type of a request, so therefore it was able to give me an answer, and I found out that that host was up. This is also something that would very often slip by IDSs and other kinds of firewall. Let's take a look at what else we've got. Here, let me clear the screen again. How about doing just a reliable scan? If you are working on your own internal organization, for example, and doing your internal penetration tests or just any kind of a security audit, you might be able to use something called a TCP scan. That would be an Nmap, and then a -ST, and then your target. In this case, again, let's just go to 10.10.10.0 subnet mask, and we'll scan for any open ports on this. This will attempt a full three-way handshake. So it'll send a SYN, it'll receive a SYN ACK back from the host on any ports that are anything that's open, and then it will send back an ACK to complete the connection. Now, this type of a scan is probably the most reliable, and the performance is reasonably good. However, do be aware of the fact that it is very noisy, and many IDSs would pick this up. So if you're performing this internally, you might even have to make an exception for your own IP address in the IDS. Otherwise, it could just shut you down. And by the way, this might take a little bit of time, but if you are wondering if it's actually doing anything or if it's actually hung or something like that, just press the space bar and it'll give you kind of status updates. Now, I've pressed the space bar a couple of times, and that's why it gave me some of this information here. And you can see here I pressed the space bar a few more times. I was getting a little impatient. I wanted this thing to finish. Anyway, this is a really good scan because it's extremely reliable, and not only does it show you what hosts are up, like this one right here, but it also shows you what ports are open on those hosts. So a very kind of a full-featured type of a scan, although it's noisy, as I said. So this has got this particular item right here at 10.10.10.1. That's actually just my internet router for my consumer-level internet router in my home office. And we can see that it's open to 51 and 80 and 443. And it's open to these because, and this is actually kind of handy to know, most of these internet routers nowadays, these small office, home office items, actually have a web page that you can connect to configure them. And so, you know, if I can get to a small business somewhere and figure out that it's got one of those kinds of routers, then it's kind of a rudimentary matter to actually break into some of those things and to compromise them. And we'll talk more about that when we get to wireless networks later on as well. Anyway, so there's some other hosts with lots of different things open. This is probably a domain controller here. Yeah, that's a domain controller right here, and it's got a lot of different domain controller-ish kinds of ports open. Let's get to the bottom here and see how long did this actually take. 1,408.10 seconds. I just happen to know that that's actually, let me calculate that in my head real quick. Oh yeah, 23.46 minutes. Actually, I couldn't really calculate that in my head. I had to cheat and use the calculator a little bit earlier today. But anyway, there it is. It actually took so long that I got impatient with it, went to my son's football game, came back hours later to finish this recording, and particularly this clip where we identify what TCP, or excuse me, what a TCP scan can do for us. All right, now if you take a look at these, you'll notice that they're all TCP ports that are open. And that's because we ran a TCP Connect scan, but sometimes you need to know about UDP ports as well. For example, this would give up the fact that it's maybe running a DHCP server or an SNMP server, or maybe a, what else would there be? Oh, DNS server. Even though we see DNS for other reasons on TCP, you might also want to know about UDP, because that would allow you to do something like a zone transfer if you can exploit that possibility. So what we would do here is to do a UDP scan, you need to run sudo, click in here, sudo, and then you would type in nmap, of course, and then SU, capital U there. And then you'll run the host that you're trying to run the scan against. And I'm just going to run it against a single host because the UDP scan, since it doesn't actually make a full connection, it also takes a long time to run. So I'm just going to demonstrate it on this single machine, and we'll type in my password, and we'll see what comes up here. And we can see here that there are several UDP ports open, such as port 123. This is a time protocol which allows the domain controller to synchronize with an authoritative time source, and ultimately in a Windows domain environment it'll synchronize all the clocks in the domain to within just a fraction of one another, and so they can keep up to date. Then there's 53, that's UDP for domain. That would tip me off that I might be able to do a zone transfer here if this domain controller, or this DNS server, excuse me, has not been properly protected. And then of course there's NetBIOS there. So we see a few different UDP ports open as well. Now another type of a scan you might want to run, and this is just kind of a cleanup scan, or one that you want to use to confirm that you're on the right subnets, is an Nmap -S capital L. That's a list scan against whatever you think your target is. Now, you may already have instructions on this because of the contract you sign as a pen tester. Or they may have been ubiquitous about this, or kind of vague about what their subnets are, saying, hey, you figure it out. If you're such a great pen tester, find out what subnets we're using. If you're in that situation, then you'll first of all make some kind of an educated guess, of course, on what the subnet is. But you're not exactly sure, because it could be that with whatever the subnet is has been split up by an ISP or something like that, so that it's maybe using classless interdomain routing, or CIDR, or custom subnetting, something like that, so you don't maybe have a full Class C address range. And that would be the case, and I would go ahead and run this scan, and this will depend, again, of course, upon reverse lookups in DNS. And what I'm looking for here is, I don't even have any hosts down in here, so these we can kind of ignore anyway. But what I want to look for is some name that's resolved. And let's just pretend here for a moment that I see this Mac, Ubuntu Mac.accusource.local at this IP address, and maybe starting at .81, here it shows some other host at companyxyz.com. Well, then I've been able to come up with kind of a demarcation line saying, oh, well, apparently, starting from this point down, these are all hosts that are not part of my pen test, and I should ignore those, especially for liability reasons. If I start hacking against them and they're not part of my target, that could put me in a bad situation. So, starting from here, presumably up, I would hack all of those targets, or look for weaknesses in all of those targets. Now, everything I've shown you so far is a pretty noisy scan. So if you're trying to be a pen tester and try to get past firewalls and avoid detection, and you don't really want to be a suicide hacker, and you're not interested in going to prison yet again, then what you want to do is to run a stealthy scan. So we'll use Nmap to do this, and so I would just type Nmap, something like this, and then an SP, maybe if you want to do a ping scan. Now, by itself, remember earlier I said that's a very noisy scan. Why? Because it sends out a lot of parallel pings to a lot of different hosts all at once. It's just a flashing red beacon saying you're being scanned immediately. So what we want to do is to help to tone that down a little bit. I can do a -T, cap T, and then something like 0, which is paranoid, or 1, which is polite, or 2, which is sneaky, or 3, which is the default. So if you do it without any T options, that's what it's going to do anyway. Then there's 4, which is aggressive, and 5, which is insane. And of course, especially those last 2 or 3 would be only ones you would do internally when you're performing in your own scans. So here, if I wanted to be paranoid or polite, let's just go with polite for the time being, then hopefully that would help me to avoid detection. Another thing you could do with this, by the way, is if you've been able to do certain other kinds of recon, maybe you found out what kind of IDS they use, what brand it is. Maybe it's Checkpoint, maybe it's a Cisco product, maybe it's Snort, which is kind of a gold standard as well of IDSs. Then you can also at least look up what the default values are. Very often, administrators don't change those default values. They'll say, hey, we spent thousands of dollars on Checkpoint. I'm assuming that the default values are fine, and so I'm just going to set it up that way. Hopefully my thousands of dollars went somewhere. So what you'll want to do is find out what that threshold is, and then go right beneath that threshold. Because very often, you do have to be a little bit impatient as well if you're on a time limit. All right, so we'll go to 10.10.10.0/24. And this, of course, now might take a little bit longer to run, maybe quite a lot longer to run, but at least it won't be quite as obvious. And we see that using the T1 option here, it took 902 seconds to perform that scan. And if you want to know something more about the details of what's going on with that, if you just go to the Nmap page, and I'm just going to show you the address here, just go to nmap.org. There's a book for performance there, and it'll show you not only these options. Let me kind of straighten this up a little bit here. But down at the bottom, it shows you what the T0, what T1, and so forth means, and how long it'll wait between attempts. For example, I think the T1 is 15 seconds, if I can put my eyes on it. Oh, yeah, 15 seconds in between the scans. There's also a lot of other things you can do to make things sneakier as well. For example, you can do a minimum rate or a maximum rate to directly control the scanning rate if you want. Further up here, you can see a scan delay, several things like that. And you'll need to only do those if you're very well aware of what type of an IDS is used and how sensitive it is to the scan. In addition to backing off the timing, there's some other things we can do to help avoid detection, such as using an inverse scan. There's a few different kinds. There's a Christmas tree scan, a null scan, fin scan, sin scan. Let's start here with the sin scan. This a lot of times is it's kind of like the lifetime network. I don't remember what they call it now. Maybe it's the oxygen network, or I don't know. It's the network that my mom always likes to watch. And she's an elderly woman who just likes to watch these movies in the afternoon. And usually what happens is some man and woman are in a happy relationship, and then it turns out that he's actually some evil, wicked person. So she breaks up with him. And then a little bit later on in the movie, he wants to get revenge on her. So he'll call her up in the middle of the night and just breathe heavily into the phone. She says, "Who is that?" No answer. And then he just hangs up. That's kind of what a sin scan is as well. You see, he calls in the middle of the night saying, "Hey, I want to establish a connection with you over this phone line." And she answers back, "Hello?" And then he just breathes heavily into the phone. That's not really in the diagram here, but he breathes heavily into the phone and doesn't say anything. He just wants to see if she's home so he can come over and terrorize her, as is the case in most of those Lifetime Network movies. Anyway, and then instead of completing the transaction with allowing a conversation to take place, the bad guy then, in the third step here, he just does a reset. Yeah, he just hangs up. And then he jumps in his, I don't know, luxury Mercedes or something like that, and then goes over and tries to kill people or something. Anyway, so that's kind of how the sin is as well. The sin attack goes like this. We start off acting like we want a normal three-way communication to take place with a three-way handshake. So if the port is open, this host here will send back an ACK. And then we'll say, "Oh, good, the port's open. I don't really need to know anything else." Then we just breathe heavily into the phone. It's not really in the diagram. And then we actually send back this reset, which tears down the connection. It has a couple of advantages. Number one, there's no full connection to log or monitor. So if there's other software in play that can monitor connections and things like that, there's really nothing for it to do here because we closed the connection. The other thing is, this is going to be a little bit more stealthy for IDSs because, again, there's no full connection going on. Now, how would we actually see that if we were to use it in action? We might do you have to elevate privilege, so we'd do a sudo nmap and then a -s capital S and then a 10.10.10. Whatever your host is, like this, and then I'd press enter, and you can see that we're able to easily identify various open ports over on that domain controller. Now, there's a few different kinds of scans that are useful for slicing through firewalls, especially packet filtering firewalls that are not stateful inspection. They may, and are very often likely to be, still detected by IDSs, however, so keep that in mind. But the ones that we're talking about here would be the remaining ones, the fin, null, and Christmas tree scans. And the reason why they're so unusual, first of all, and likely to pass through the firewalls, is because network devices like firewalls are normally RFC compliant. Now, that stands for Request for Comments, and it really covers a lot of things regarding network communication and even many other things. But that's the rule set for how TCP/IP is constructed and how normal communication should take place. Well, if we send a fin scan when we never had a full communication take place and there's no existing communications channel going on between the two hosts, a non-stateful firewall will go ahead and forward that packet because that's kind of like it doesn't know what else to do with it. It says, "Hey, you're trying to make a gentle close against a host that you've never had a communications with." So it just goes ahead and sends it on. And that's one of the reasons why this can be kind of a stealthy one, because it's able to get through firewalls that it might not otherwise be able to get through to. Now, as we take a look at it, though, what do we see? Yeah, the host is up, but is it true that all 1,000 or so ports are closed on .90? No. Because we just did a scan, and we saw a whole bunch of open ports on that domain controller. So what's going on with this? Well, this is a Windows host that we're performing this scan against. And all of these types of scans that I'm talking about here, the fin, Christmas tree, and null scans, are not normally responded to very well by Windows. Windows actually does a pretty good job in this case of protecting itself against these kind of sneaky scans. This would work much better against I'm trying to think, well, a Linux or a Unix system. me try to think of a host that I could send this to. Oh, I got one. I got one right here. Let's go to. I got another Linux machine that's on another computer across my office here. I think we should be able to get something out of that one. So let's see what it gives us. Yeah, sure enough. Okay, so I've got 5900 open over there because I've got VNC running, and I want to be able to connect to it and make this type of a connection. You see, right now I'm using VNC to connect to a different host. I think it's .80 that I'm connecting to right now. But .90, excuse me, .80 over here is also configured as an Ubuntu Linux system, and we can see here that it's responding to that type of a scan. And then here I ran another scan, and this one, as you can see, where was it? It was a null scan, SN. You can see the N right there. This one does identify that that host is up, but it's not very good at scanning the ports here, at least on that particular system. And this, again, is why I have to use several different types of scans, because some will be successful and others will not be. Let's try and see what happens if I do a Christmas tree scan, which obviously would be SX. I'll press enter here. And we see that this one was also able to identify all those ports as open. By the way, the Christmas tree scan actually has several different flags marked. It's 3 flags that are never supposed to be set all at the same time. That would be the fin, push, and urgent flags. That's why we call it the Christmas tree scan, because it lights up like a Christmas tree. And then finally, I would definitely know about something here, and that would be the fragmented scan. You could use both Nmap and hping3 and a few other tools to do this. But what will happen is maybe I want to run that same command. Let's go ahead and run this Christmas tree scan here with a -F. That means to fragment any packets that it sends across. So normally, if it might be able to send across this message in a single packet, it's going to fragment it into multiple packets. Why is that important in stealth? Because if we have an IDS, it might be able to see a single packet and see that, oh, that packet looks suspicious because of the flags that are set and maybe something that's in the payload or whatever. However, if we fragment it, we kind of chop it up into tiny little pieces and then send it across, and then the IDS does not have anything cohesive to grab a hold of to raise suspicion. It'd be kind of like this. If you had a 2,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, you just reach in the box without looking and pull out one piece and look at that one piece. It would be very difficult to say what exactly that puzzle was a part of. It's kind of like that with the fragment scan, and you can also use this -F with hping3. At least on a single host, this should still work pretty fast regardless, and we can again see that we get the same result, but that -F is actually a pretty good idea to fragment. Now let's talk here about something called a side channel attack. What this does is it uses something that you've probably heard of a lot of times, and that's to spoof an IP address. And we see that in Hollywood movies and stuff like that. You know, people say, hey, where did this email come from or something? And they say, I don't know, they spoofed the IP address. Or we don't know where this network attack is coming from. They spoofed the IP address. Well, there's a little bit of misinformation about all of that, because anytime you spoof an address, you cannot directly receive any response back. So, for example, if you were, or if you were in some Hollywood movie and you were trying to download something from some high-level military command, and you were trying to use the spoofed IP address, well, none of that data would come back to you. It would go back to wherever that spoofed IP address is. It could be some unsuspecting student's laptop computer at the University of Michigan or something like that, and it would all be trying to arrive back at their machine that you're spoofing. Well, that doesn't really help you much in terms of things like data transfer. However, for things such as identifying open ports, you can certainly do that. And let's take a look at what happens. Remember, we have a 3-way handshake that normally takes place, right? And we saw that 1, 2, 3, handshake take place in a previous whiteboard. Here, let's take a look at what happens in what we call a side channel attack, where we're spoofing the IP. With this, what happens is it depends on something called the IP ID. With each network communication, there is a unique IP identifier for each one of those connections. And what we start off with doing is just a SYN-ACK. Now notice that's not a SYN, and it's not an ACK, it's a total, it's a SYN-ACK, the same way you would do if you were responding to a host. So we will send a SYN-ACK to the zombie. Okay, this is the IP address that we are spoofing, okay? So ultimately, this is the host that we want to attack. This is a server, let's say, and this is you over here on your laptop, okay? And this is the server. Okay? Now, what we'll do is we'll send that SYN-ACK, and then we'll get back from this host right here a reset, because it's saying, hey, why are you sending me a SYNAC? We don't even have any communications going on, so I'm going to reset that. All right. All we care about is we don't care that they reset it. All we care about is we want to see what their IP identifier is when they do that. Now, I use the number 1,000 for simplicity's sake, and these are often very high numbers, and they don't always increment by exactly 1. But we do want the incrementation to be predictable. For example, when you do something like this with Windows machines, many Windows machines will increment by 256. All right. But anyway, we get an IP ID back of 1,000. Now, what's the third packet that's sent? Now that we have this information, we'll send a SYN packet with the zombie's IP address of .31 over here to the server that we're trying to attack. Now, the server, again, we're not trying to download data or something like that. We just want to see what responses we're getting. So the server will send back a SYN ehack, but it'll send it to our zombie because that's the IP address that it had in the original SYN. So it says, oh, you want to establish communication with me? And it thinks that it's this host because of the IP address we use, so it'll send back a SYN ehack over here if the port is open, that is. Then this zombie says, now, why are these people sending me these SYN ehacks? I'm not trying to talk to anybody. I'll send another reset, for crying out loud. And this time, of course, it's going to increment. And again, it could be by 256, it could be by some other number, but we just want it to be predictable. So it sends back in increments, in this case, by 1. All right? Now, that's the 5th packet that's sent. The next thing we'll do is we'll send from here, from your own computer, back to the zombie, and you're going to send another SYN ehack, for crying out loud, all of these SYN ehacks. And then the zombie here will say, once again, I'm not trying to have a conversation with you. I'm going to send back a reset, and my IP ID is 1002. Now, the key in all of this is the IP IDs. We don't care if we transfer data. We don't care if we have actually established a three-way handshake, any of that stuff. We're just looking for the IP ID response. What this is telling us is if this server responded with a SYN ehack, that means they have an open port. Now, since they responded with that SYN ehack and they sent a reset back here, the zombie sent a reset, then it incremented by 1 so that the next time they talk to us over here on the 7th packet, they're going to send back an increment of 2 from their original communication with us. Do you see the difference there? Okay. Now, if this host here, if this server did not have an open port there, it would probably just be silent and not send anything back. Then, when we did our 6th packet here to send a SYN ehack back, and we got our 7th packet back from this zombie, then it would not increment by 2, it would increment by 1. And then we would know that this port was closed. All right. But let me undo all of that. Since it incremented by 2, we know that this port was open. And another thing that could have happened here is this could be filtered. So, for example, if on this host, the port is not open and it's got maybe like the Windows firewall or something like that, instead of just being silent, very often it'll just send back a reset. And when it sends back a reset, there's no response from the zombie. Okay, so again, that would have incremented here by 1 instead of by 2, and we would then know that that particular port we were looking for was closed. Okay, but let me undo all of that. Another thing of note here, look at this item right here. Notice that that's a printer. You're thinking, James, why are you using a printer? Well, it's an IP printer. And IP printers are, depending on which ones they are, they might be more silent, so to speak, than a desktop workstation where people are constantly surfing the internet, downloading email. Maybe they're downloading MP3s from Amazon, doing their Christmas shopping and whatnot. Well, you see, if this were something like a conventional, user-side computer, a desktop machine where it's all that busy, then we could not get predictability out of our sequence IDs. We want something that's mostly just sitting there, not really doing a whole awful lot. So you might be able to use a zombie that's, on the other side of the planet where it's the middle of the night at the time that you're doing this, or something that's just not very busy very often. What Nmap does is it first will detect to see whether or not the zombie is a good candidate. And if it sees that it's really busy and it's not able to get predictable IP IDs out of it, then it will abandon that one and tell you that it's not a good candidate for a zombie. At which point you'll pick some other zombie. Now, before we explain what we're seeing here, I want to point out that the main purpose for performing a side channel attack, also known as an idle scan, is to avoid detection. Because we're using a spoofed IP address, the attacked host will think that it's being attacked from that spoofed IP address and not directly from us. Now, here you can see I've run a scan, and I've just repeated the command that I typed up above down here at the bottom so you can see it for easy reference. This is what I typed in down here to get these results. So what was I doing? Well, you have to elevate your privileges here, and I ran nmap with a -pn. And this avoids host detection and just assumes that it's up, doesn't send the ICMPs and all of that. And then a -p- means that it's going to scan all well-known ports. Okay, so it's going to scan all of them. And I could have specified a specific number there if I wanted to for performance reasons, or if I was just trying to look for an individual port. I also did a -SI. Now this is the side channel attack, where the first IP address you use, and you can also use a fully qualified domain name if DNS can resolve it, is the zombie machine. Okay, so this is the unsuspecting zombie that I'm using, and that was just a Windows Vista computer. And then this was my Windows server, my domain controller. This is my actual target over here on the far right. And this is the result that it gave me. It was able to find, of course, many open ports, and that's going to be the case with a lot of domain controllers because they have to service a lot of different functions. But you can see that I also, made it an FTP server, an HTTP server, and so forth. Also, there is trial and error with these things. This was not my first attempt at this. You always have to find a good zombie. There might be firewalls up in some places that will affect this as well. For example, when it does this, to use this zombie right here, it looks for port 80. All right? And if it can't find port 80 open, then it will say that it's not a good zombie or it's unable to get to port. In fact, I think I got that up here somewhere. Let me look for it. Yeah, right here. Okay, so I was trying to do a scan, an idle scan, also known as a side channel scan, and I did a sudo and same command here, 49 and 90. Okay, it's the same actual command that I used earlier, but in this case it said port 80 cannot be used because it's not returned any of our probes. What was going on with that? Well, that particular Vista machine at that time had its firewall up, and that's something that you also have to look out for. The firewall would prevent this from happening. The exception to that would be the firewall could have been up, but it might actually be running web services, which normally will enable port 80 through the firewall when you do that. And so then that would have still worked even with the firewall up. For demonstration purposes in our case, I just disabled the firewall, and then we could see here that we were able to then get a result from all of this. Now on my zombie computer, I was also running Wireshark at the time that I ran that Nmap side channel attack. Let's review first of all what we've got going on here. The .49 computer is my zombie. The .70 computer is my attacking host from which I'm running Nmap. My destination attack target is .90. Okay, that's my Windows Server domain controller. All right. So let's see what's going on here. And the significant parts of these are only the reset packets because we're using those to see whether or not the identification ID increments. Now, selecting this packet here, we see that a reset went back from the zombie to my attacking host. What's the identification number? 63. It ends in 63 here. All right. Now the next reset we see is from the zombie over to my server that I'm attacking. What's the increment here? .64. What this is telling me so far is that there was a port open, and you can see that we were looking for port 21. That's why it says FTP there. Then the zombie computer sends a response back again to my attacking computer at .70, and we see that this number is 65. So let's review that again. What did we have going on here? We had a reset here of 63. We had a reset here of 64. We had a reset here of 65. And because it incremented by 2, since the last communication between these two hosts, the last previous communication was up here. There's 63. There's 65. That's how we know that the FTP port was open. In this nugget, we looked at scanning. This was part 2, where we took a look at some additional tools, such as Netcat, which we may visit again later on because it's a pretty powerful tool. We also looked at Nexpose. There's also Bitty Blah and some other things that we looked at. And there's also the Nmap tool. Now, this really was the majority of our discussion. Most of the things we did in this whole video related to Nmap in one way or the other, including the side channel attack, also known as an idle scan, where we spoofed the IP address. And the purpose of doing so was to evade detection, because we don't want the IP address from the attacked host being tracked back directly to us. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.